Welcome to the Bronzegate speaker series. I'm Adam Akbar. I founded and lead Bronzegate. We're a specialist executive search firm. And with the speaker series, we're trying to introduce some interesting speakers with topical ideas around talent management and leadership. And I have the particular advantage and benefit of knowing a good friend, Navid Nazimi, who is a hugely experienced chap in the field of executive transition. So I'll introduce Navid shortly, but Navid's background is fascinating because he's been for many years a leading HR executive with companies like Roche and Vodafone, where he's had practical experience of managing executive transition, i.e. onboarding external executives into organizations. And then on top of that, he is an executive coach with lots of experience within this field. And thirdly, he spent several years now researching a book which is out in January, which is entitled Mastering Executive Transitions. So really pleased to welcome Navid on board, and I'll pass the floor to him.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in. It's my absolute pleasure to be sharing with you the key essence of my book. And this is something that has indeed taken me around 7 years to bring to fruition, and something that I feel very, very passionate about. Let me see, and Adam, if you could give me just a quick hint, if you're able to see the slides.
Yes, able to see it, thanks.
Perfect. All right, good. So this is what oftentimes happens. I get a phone call from a number that is not known to me. And usually there is either the exec or the HR leader on the other end of the line and wants to talk to me about this topic of transition. So they have received the big promotion news, or they are about to make a transition into another organization. And that's how I often contract with leaders. So what are we going to cover today in our short time we have together? We're going to look at what are the most common executive transition challenges. We will look together at what is the actual failure rate and what is the cost of failure to leaders and organizations, before we look at 7 proven interventions that actually work in real practice. So these are interventions that work to make executives more successful when they are transitioning. And there's a short case study that I have in the deck as well. So depending on how we get along, we may also have a look at that. And lastly, if there is any interest, we can also open up the floor to questions and answers, and also take a glimpse into what the future may hold. So first off, what is an executive transition coach? And I get that question asked quite a few times here and there. And the way I would look at it is, you have what is classically a so-called first 90 days advisor. So you may all have heard or read this wonderful book, The First 90 Days from Michael Watkins. And what you see on the left-hand side is someone who's trained on the methodology. So someone who works on the first 90-day framework. And on the right-hand side, you see your classic leadership development coach. This is your executive coach that often is brought in to work with a senior leader on something that may have to do with behavioral traits, with self-awareness, with support in a developmental way. And so what an executive transition coach does is essentially combining the best of both worlds. So there are elements of a transition that are more concrete and more short-term focused, such as a defined 100 or 120-day action plan. But there will be elements of the transition that far extend beyond the first 100, 120 days. So typically I contract with the executive leaders for a 12 or 18 months period. And that's because the performance cycle in most organizations is around that same timeline. And executive transitions typically last over a year or so. So this is what the term executive transition coach is trying to define as. If we then look at what are common executive transition challenges, there are plenty. And I've 8 of those listed on this slide, but I think some of the more prominent ones are when the executive has been hired as a new exec into an organization. You may also have a case where someone has been promoted into the group exco level. So someone who's been maybe within the organization and now has to step up to the very top and making sure that what they deliver and do is appropriate at that level. There could be many more challenges, as you can see here, but I think some of them are around turning around a business unit or an organizational function, or it could be around an international move or a cross-functional challenge. So as you can see, there are many, many types of transitions that could pose a challenge to the exec. And also what I want to mention here is that oftentimes the same transition may be a stacking of several transitions. And the case study that I have with me today is a C-level case study where someone had to go through 7 transitions at the same time. And this is really a different level of complexity, obviously. So let's look at strategy execution before we get into transitions. This is how I came to write my book. And the simple insight here is that 2 out of 3 well-formulated strategies fail. And the reason is that they are not being executed properly. If you then start to double click on why that is, I mean, you know, we're talking about large-scale organizations or mid-sized organizations who have professional support externally and internally in place. How come that only 1 out of 3 strategies are executed properly? So if we double click on that, we see that executive transitions is one of the key factors that actually gets in the way. So I have a data point here from Heidrick & Struggles, one of the largest search firms in the world. And because they're a publicly listed company, they have to open up their checkbook and the data points to a lot of people. And so what the CEO did is when he was asked in an interview, they looked at over a 10-year time period, how many executive leaders they had placed into many organizations. And they found out that over that 10-year time period and looking at over 20,000 executive placements, 40% of those were not enrolled 18 months after their appointment. So that's a very relevant data set. But there are also other studies from Center for Creative Leadership, McKinsey, and Egon Zehnder who come to the very same conclusion. If you look at the CEO turnover rate, it has increased by almost 80%. And so 1 out of 3 CEOs is actually forced out of the role, either by the investors, by the board, or by the organization, quite frankly. So again, there's lots of data points suggesting that almost half of all executive transitions fail, irrespective of the industry and irrespective of the size of the organization. Which kind of brings us to the question of how can that be and why is that? Why is it that so many executives seem to be failing? Now, before we get into what I call the exponentially challenged executive leader, let me start with a simple question here. And that is, would you consider to go ahead and register yourself for the next marathon in your city? So if you're not a seasoned runner, this suggestion and concept might sound like a foolish idea to you. It certainly does to me. And yet many executive leaders are going through their first or second transition without any guidance or experienced support and simply aim to wing it. And many organizations watch them doing that without supporting them with a professional kind of support. And this is why, in a nutshell, 40% of executive transitions are failing as we speak. But let's get a little more granular on that. And let's look at what I call the exponentially challenged exec. And by the way, the 40% failure rate and pretty much everything I cover in my book looks at the pre-pandemic levels. I deliberately didn't want to take a one-time event such as the global pandemic as a reason to extrapolate things and base the book on. But with one exception on this slide, everything I'm going to cover for you is related to the pre-pandemic levels. So the first off is, a study that was done by Egon Zehnder, another large search firm. And they did that survey with over 400 CEOs, 416 in total. And 70% of the CEOs said they were either underwhelmed by their onboarding process or they had no structured onboarding at all. Now, mind you, if this is what the CEOs of the companies are saying, what would the executive onboarding look like for someone who's a CFO or someone who is maybe the HRD in that same organizational firm? The second challenge I see here is, and this is related to the S&P 500, so the largest 500 capitalized companies in the US, the CEO tenure on average has come down to 5.9 years. And as it happens, 1 out of 7 CEOs actually don't make it into the 3rd year anniversary in the same organization. So you see how that is getting in the way, and how, if you know you have only 2 or 3 years eventually to perform, how you may be very short-sighted instead of doing what may be mid and long term also making sense for the organization. If you look at things like organization complexity, it has increased by a factor of 35 just over the last 15 years. And I think it's fair to say, because this is pre-pandemic, if you look at organizational complexity today with the hybrid ways of working and so many different unanswered questions, it has probably increased even further. If we do take a look at the actual top 10 reasons why executives are failing 40% of the time, I did the meta study, and it's part of my book. But if I look at the 3 grouped reasons, there are people, politics, and culture. So it's unlikely that you hire a CFO who is not very good in managing the balance sheet. It's quite likely that that same CFO may be, trapping over a cultural issue or have something on the people side that could get in the way. Executive overwhelm is something that is also very real. In one of the studies, they were measuring the executives' stress levels during their normal time. And let's face it, there's no real normal time for any exec, but certainly one where they were not going through a transition. And they did the same study with the same execs who were going through a transition of some sort. And the executives, when they ranked themselves on that stress level scale, the study found out that the stress levels that are associated with transitions are north of a divorce or a significant health issue. And so you can see, and this is why in my model, I'm also talking about the energy level of the leader, not just what's in our head and what we're good at, usually because we are at the very senior level performing. If you then start to look at the demands that's coming the way, again, executive leaders, and this is a CEO study that was conducted, a typical CEO 10 years ago used to have 4 to 7 main KPIs to perform on. And today, it's quite likely that the number is 20 plus, in many cases, more than 30 main KPIs in a CEO's performance document. If you look at the 2 recent trends, and again, this is pre-pandemic level, the job satisfaction, globally speaking, is going down, as is the employee engagement level. And again, that means that as an executive leader, you have to work on average with a workforce that is lower engaged or less engaged and less satisfied, generally speaking, with the job and the environment. If you look at things like span of control, again, gone are the days where the CEO had a handful of reports. Today, even with the establishment of a COO, it's quite likely that the CEO still has 10, 12, sometimes more than that, direct reports. And with that comes complexity. And with that, that means that you will be dragged into matters, whereas previously you had about a handful of leaders and they were looking after the functional topics. This is another interesting study, and this is from Russell Reynolds, another large search firm. And they found out that 90% of the total cost is spent on the executive hire and selection process, and less than 10% is spent on making that same executive hire successful when they're on board. So again, companies take a lot of money, throw it at the best exec, and then hope that they are going to make it and work out. And there's this inherent belief that if you take the best and brightest, that they're going to make it. And as we know, 4 out of 10 times that is actually not true. And lastly, and this is obviously a thing of a pandemic here, the Great Resignation. I read with great interest the recent McKinsey report, where they said that 1 out of 3 people who are resigning right now in the US do not have a job lineup. So people are reconsidering their choices in life. They're reconsidering whether what they're doing is actually the right thing to do. And they may not know what they want to do next, but what they know already is this is not right for me. This is not what I would like to continue doing. So I might as well just hand in my notice and start to figure out what I want to do next. So as you can see, I mean, these are all bullets, and what you see, the kind of the golden color is the executive armor. The key question then becomes, how much is the executive able to take in? And what is going to happen if this doesn't work out?